Welcome to my video on social influence revision. I'm going to do this video in the style of ASMR. No, I can't even get through the introduction. No, only joking. Welcome to my social influence video on revision. I'm going to do it normally. I'm going to try and get through as much as I can. We start then with conformity and the different types and explanations of conformity. So types of conformity come from Kelman. Three main types of conformity you need to be aware of. Firstly is the compliance. That's kind of just going along with what the majority are saying. So publicly you would act in a way that a group was acting in, but privately you would still maintain your own views. Identification is where the individual then adopts the views and behaviours of the group, publicly and privately, but is maybe not as strong a type of conformity as internalisation. And internalisation is where you live and breathe through the cause. So imagine a climate change protester, quite current at the moment. So compliance, they would go along with the crowd when they were with the group, but when they were home, they would still use as much electricity as they wanted to. Identification, they would both internally and externally, so publicly and privately, they would try and conserve energy and go along with what the group was saying. But internalisation, it becomes a part of them and a real part of their personality, and that's how you identify the differences. Dutch and Gerard then came up with the explanations. Why do these different types of conformity happen? You've got informational social influence, and this is where you believe others have a greater level of knowledge than you do on the particular area, so you'll go along with what they're saying because you feel they know more than you. And then normative social influence, this is more to do with the social side of things, so you do it to fit in, you want to be part of that group. And so that there are obviously different ways of explaining that behaviour. So normative social influence might be easier to explain identification. Normative social influence explains compliance, whereas informational social influence may explain more identification or internalisation. What do we know about these things then? Well, Lucas tested this and found that gave people maths tasks. They were either really hard maths tasks or easy maths tasks, and then people had to rate themselves as proficient, good mathematicians or poor mathematicians. And what you found was more conformity when the task was hard and they weren't they didn't rate themselves as good mathematicians. So that suggests this informational social influence. So these types of conformity do seem to have an effect. But this only applies to majority influence, so this is where you've got a bigger group maybe having an effect on a smaller group. We'll look later in the course about how smaller groups can affect larger groups. So informational and normative social influence might explain majority influence, but maybe have a harder task of explaining minority influence. So that's potentially an issue. We look at these things individually, independently, saying, well, it's normative or informational, but actually it could be a bit of both. They normally work together. It could be that you want to fit in with a group that do know more than you, so you've got informational social influence and normative social influence happening at the same time, and it's quite hard to tear them apart. Do we necessarily need to tear them apart? And there's a bit of research that suggests that well, maybe actually these are part of the same kind of process. Normative social influence is potentially more complex because there are other things going on. So who would you want to fit in with, and why? Williams and Sogon found that there was more conformity within friends than within strangers, and so it's a difficult one to know and how to tell whether it's having an impact or not. And as well as that, you put onto this, and this is the last evaluative point here, the fact that you've got individual differences, so we can't say that all people are going to be affected in the same way by normative and informational social influence and in different situations. So you could have the same person, one person in one scenario, say a maths task where they don't rate themselves as really good, they might go along with what other people are saying, whereas it might be a more creative task, an artsy task, and they back themselves and they won't be. So you've got to take the individual and the situation into account. So it's quite difficult to say, well, this is exactly why one person will comply, will follow conformity. That moves us on nicely to Asch's classic study of conformity using lines. So what happened here, there were 123 male undergraduate students, 7 people were in the room, 6 of which were Confederates, so there was 1 real participant. That real participant was sat in place number 5, sat in place number 6, so the 5 people before them were Confederates and then there was 1 after them, and they asked the real participant, after the 5 people had given a wrong answer to the line task, which was obvious, top right hand of the screen there, which is the most accurate line here to X. And so it was a test of conformity. It wanted to see what the real participant did when the other participants were giving a line. Did they conform or not? And what they found is, yes, they did. So 75% of the participants conformed at least once and gave a wrong line when it's quite obvious that the line is a particular length. So this suggests conformity does happen, and gives us an idea of majority influence. So 37% of the time participants conformed and 75% of the participants conformed at least once. You can compare this to a control group who didn't have other participants giving the wrong answer and they got it right, so that shows that the lines weren't ambiguous at all. We can then use variations on that to see what particular aspects of the majority have an effect, and there are 3 particular things. One was unanimity, which means that all of the Confederates were giving the same answer. So there was a real pressure on the real participant to also give the same answer. So they did variations where some of the participants gave the correct answer or other incorrect answers, but the key thing is they dissented, they were against the other participants, and what they found here is that conformity fell, and so this shows that having a unanimous group is really important to maintaining conformity and group pressure. Another thing is the size of the majority. 3 people in the majority giving the same answer seems to be the key number here. Any more than 3, it didn't seem to have any more effect. Any fewer, and the effect wasn't there either. So it suggests that the size of the majority is an important factor as well, up to a point. And the final thing is that the nature of the task. So again, this task was quite it was easy to know the right answer. When it's harder to know, when there's a lack of clarity, actually conformity increases. More people conformed when they weren't as sure of the answer, whereas here they knew the answer and 25% didn't conform. So that shows, yeah, those 3 things: unanimity, size of the majority, and nature of the task have an effect on whether people conform or not. So what can we say about the study then? Well, the biggest criticism of it is that it can be said to lack ecological validity or mundane realism. So the task, judging line lengths, when are you ever actually going to have to do that in real life, unless you're an engineer or something? Well, it's quite important actually if you're an engineer, isn't it? But most people every day don't have to do that sort of task. So can we actually say that this is why groups have pressure on people, such as climate change or civil rights or gay rights, things like that? And again, that comes up later on. As well as this, it was an undergraduate, so they were all late teens, early 20s, and they were all male. So can we apply these results to other populations? Potentially not. Another criticism is that it was in the 50s and in America, and at that time there was a big threat from communism, and it's thought that people did want to be more like each other. So it can be argued that maybe this experiment was a child of its time. People were more concerned about social norms, whereas is that the case today? People are more engaged in more self-obsessed. You just look at the Kardashians, and you can see that actually, well, maybe people aren't as concerned about what other people are saying. That was also supported by Perrin and Spence. They replicated the study in the UK in the 80s and found a lot lower level of conformity. So this suggests that maybe the original Asch study was a child of its time. And Bond and Smith then conducted the study. Well, didn't conduct the study, but looked at a meta-analysis of studies that have been done over different areas, and found 31 Asch type tasks, and found conformity was higher in collectivist cultures, where the group is more important than the individual. And so, yeah, the time when the study was done, the culture that it's done in does seem to have an effect as well. Next in conformity comes Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. I do like the conformity topic, lots of nice juicy research to sink your teeth into. So this famous study, Stanford prison experiment, it was a mock prison set up to see whether people would conform, so it's still about conformity, to social roles, to the roles they think people play in society. And in this instance, obviously, it was guards and prisoners. So they got 24 college students, they pre-tested them for any psychological disorders or anything, found them all to be okay, and then randomly assigned them to either being a prisoner or a guard. And they then basically put them in this mocked up situation of a prison. Zimbardo was the prison officer, the prison warden, and then they were told to go do your job, see what happens. So the prisoners were given numbers instead of names. The guards wore these glasses, reflective glasses, where you couldn't see their eyes, a bit of de-individuation there, and it was then they set it up to see what would happen over the next 2 weeks. What did they find? Well, they found that it couldn't last for the 2 weeks because the conditions were so extreme. So it was stopped after 6 days because of the extreme outcomes. The prisoners and the guards took their social roles extremely seriously. So the guards would inflict meaningless punishments on the prisoners. They would sleep deprive them, put them in put bags over their head. They would lock them in solitary confinement, douse them in water, generally embarrass them, and the prisoners took their role well as well. So they rebelled at times, they staged a protest, but they kind of ended up sinking back into themselves a bit, much like prisoners would. And actually 3 of the prisoners had to be released early due to the negative effects. So what do we find? Everyone really did conform to their roles very much as expected. What can we say about this? Well, it can be argued that there's good validity here. There was a high level of control. As I said, the prisoners and the guards, well, the students were pre-tested before the study to check that they had no individual differences that would affect the results at the end, and there was random allocation, so that's really good. The environment was obviously very well controlled as well. It was all set up, it was all recorded, there was a high level of internal validity, which was good, but we can question the external validity. Can we apply this to real prisons and real life? It's very hard to say. The prisoners, obviously, and the guards knew that they weren't actually in prison, and so could that affect the results? There's also huge claims of demand characteristics, and it's been in the press recently that there's claims that Zimbardo faked a lot of what was happening. He put ideas in the guards' heads as to what they should do, and it was really, they weren't acting on the social roles, they were pretty much almost acting as though it was a play that they were in. And so can we actually take this seriously as a bit of scientific research? That's questions. Zimbardo's unsurprisingly defended that and said that that's not the case, but it's hard to tell here. Also, don't get confused with the film that you watch. Lots of people seem to think people were beaten to death and all sorts. That didn't happen in the real thing. That was just a film. There are differences. There were also individual differences in the response to the role. So it was claimed that a third of the guards took their role uber seriously, and one called himself Cool Hard Luke and was really acted up to the role. About a third of them acted normally as guards would, and then a third really weren't interested. So there are individual differences here in how people react to social roles. This study was also replicated, and if you get a chance to see the BBC replication, then it's a good documentary. So Riker and Haslam redid the prison experiment in the BBC, but found completely different results. The guards had no effect, no influence, and the prisoners actually ended up taking over the prison. And it's thought that maybe this was due to the fact that the prisoners gained a sense of group cohesion, whereas the guards didn't in this scenario. But if we compare that then to the Zimbardo experiment, it was very different. Does this then question our reliability and replicability of the study potentially? And also, not to mention, last but not least, the ethics. It was very ethically unsound. So participants were harmed, they were deceived. There was lots of negative things happening here that it was hard to just debrief and say it was okay. I think people had issues after taking part in this study for some time. Okay, that's it for conformity then, and obviously conformity is changing your behaviour or your thinking, your cognitions to a real or imagined group pressure. And we move on to obedience, and that is direct instruction, generally from an individual, or direct orders. That's how the two are different. And we move on to another important, famous bit of research. It's Milgram's research and the variation of Milgram's study. So Milgram's study was the electric shock study. It was conducted at Yale University on 40 male participants. What they did, they came into the study with another person. They thought that other person was another participant. They weren't. They were in fact a confederate. They thought they had the chance of either being the role called the learner or the teacher, but it was fixed so that they would always get the role of the teacher. And what they were told was that the other person had been randomly chosen to be the learner. They had to go into another room. They were asked questions, had to give answers to those questions, and if they got those answers wrong, the role of the participant as the teacher was to then give a shock. So they had a machine in front of them that had 15-volt increments, and they were told that every time they got it wrong, they had to give them a shock and then turn the volts up on the machine in front of them. They also had an experimenter in the room with them, wearing a white coat and telling them to give the shocks, and that if the person doesn't respond or responds incorrectly, they had to give the shock and make sure that they did that. And so it was to see, the test was to see whether the real participants obeyed, so obedience, responded to the direct instruction from the experimenter. It looked a bit like this. So you had the experimenter and the teacher, who was the real participant, in one room, and then you had this student in another. There wasn't actually well, there was someone in the other room, but it was all a pre-recorded response. They weren't actually giving electric shocks. However, they thought they were, and that was the big issue. So what happened? Well, as I say, they were told to shock them and turn the voltage up, and all of the participants did that up to 300 volts. That's a very high level of obedience. People were doing as they were told to. And actually, about 65% of the participants turned the voltage right up to the full voltage, which was 450 volts, and it had danger, severe shock on it. So they, that would be a deadly shock, and they still gave those what they thought were the shocks. So that suggests that people are obedient to orders. When they're given, they do as they're told, and it helped Milgram explain why things happened, such as the Holocaust in World War II, because actually what we'd say is that, well, maybe the Nazi soldiers at the gas chambers were just doing as they were told. They were told to carry out these orders, and they carried them out, and we as humans are quite obedient in certain situations, and that's where the variations in the study came in. So it was tested to see what factors of the Milgram study might have changed the results. So in one variation, they gave the orders over the phone rather than the experimenter being there face to face, and this reduced the amount of obedience. So it seems as though we're more obedient in face to face situations. They also had a situation where the victim couldn't be seen or heard, and this slightly increased, but mainly around led to mainly around the same level of obedience, about 66%. What really reduced the amount of obedience was where they had the participant, and they actually had to, rather than being in a different room, they were in the same room, and they had to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate. That unsurprisingly reduced the level of obedience to about 30%. Another variation, this seems quite key, and we'll come back to this, was the legitimacy of the authority figure. So if they didn't seem as legitimate, so when they were wearing the lab coat, the white lab coat to begin with, it was about 65%. But when the experimenter was a member of the public dressed in normal clothes, that the obedience shot right down to 18%. So being a legitimate authority figure seems to be a really important part of obedience when people listen to us. When the teacher was paired with another teacher who was actually a stooge, a Confederate, the shocks again were around the same, quite high levels. When the victim was only a metre away from the participant, that reduced the levels of obedience. When another Confederate refused to give shock, so we spoke about this in the Asch study, and this comes up later in the spec as well. When you've got dissenters, other people that say no, then this really seems to have an effect, as I said, in Asch on conformity, but also in obedience. So here, it was only 10% when there was another Confederate that said, no, I'm not giving the shocks. Then the real participant also said, well, I'm not giving the shocks either. So having social support seems to be a really important factor in resisting obedience and conformity. And then finally, it's to do with legitimacy as well, but where the experiment takes place. The original was at Yale University, so the participants might have been thinking, oh, well, it's a prestigious university, they won't let me do anything bad. Whereas when it was in a rundown office, this reduced the levels of obedience again. So there seems to be certain factors that lead to will more likely lead to obedience, and that's quite key. Getting into evaluation then, and much like the Asch study again, we're going to say that maybe there's a lack of realism here, and so can we actually apply these results? So did the participants actually believe that they were giving electric shocks? Maybe not. Maybe they knew it was a bit of an experiment, so there was demand characteristics. Why wasn't the experimenter the one doing it themselves? So there's questions on the internal validity and the experimental realism of the study. However, Milgram refuted this and said that actually participants, because they showed distress and anxiety when they were turning the shocks up, which they did, this suggests that they were treating it realistically. So actually that suggests that it did have good realism. And also Rosenhauer interviewed the participants, and 70% of them believed that they were actually giving the shocks. So that's a bit of a counterpoint there. That would be a nice double whopper paragraph for some sort of evaluation. There's also ethical considerations here. They were told they were taking part in a study on memory when actually it was conformity, so that was they were deceived. The right to withdraw was a big issue here. Some participants said, I want to leave, and they were told things like, please continue, go on, the experiment requires you to continue, it's absolutely essential you continue, you have no other choice but to go on. So they weren't allowed to leave the study, and that's an ethical issue. And protection from harm as well. They were clearly distressed and upset about taking part in the study. There are support in terms of reliability of the study because it's been replicated. There was a French TV show that replicated the Milgram study and found very, very similar levels of obedience. Darren Brown's also done it in the UK and again found very, very similar levels. So that suggests that we have got some sort of consistent findings. I've already mentioned demand characteristics, but another issue is that, well, okay, so you've got 65% who did go up to the total. Well, what about the others that didn't? So it's not guaranteed that people are going to obey to an authority figure. There are still a healthy percentage who don't, and that comes up later in the spec as well. Why may some people be more likely to obey a demand or command and others not? And then finally, we've got some supporting research, two quite famous studies. You've got Hoffling. Hoffling got a fake doctor to call up nurses, real nurses, and ask them to administer a drug that they knew, that the nurses should have known through their training, would be lethal. And they found that 21 out of the 22 nurses agreed to give that. They didn't let them, obviously. And then Bickman went to people in the street, and this was testing the legitimacy of the authority figures. They had someone in a sports jacket and tie, they had a milkman, and then they had someone dressed as a security guard, and they asked them to do things such as pick up litter from the street or put money in a parking meter, and they found that people were much more likely to observe the security guard. So there you've got two nice supporting bits of research which have got really good external validity because they're actually happening in the real world, and it does suggest that obedience does occur in real life situations and backs up Milgram's study. We then move on to explanations of obedience, and these generally fall into two categories. They're either situational or dispositional, and some of them we've already covered. So starting with the social psychological factors, these tend to be the situational ones, and there's two really that you need to be aware of, and I've massively condensed this down into the shortest way I can. And the first we've already covered in Milgram's research. It's the legitimacy of authority. So if the person that's telling you to do the task that they're telling you to do, don't forget that obedience is response to a direct instruction. If they're seen as legitimate, so if it's from a fireman or a doctor or a policeman or a teacher, then people are more likely to respond to that than it would be the average person on the street in normal clothes. That's known as legitimacy of authority, and it's a situational factor for influencing obedience. The other is known as the agentic state, and what this means is people feel as though they're acting as an agent, so they're not acting on their own. The responsibility is taken away from themselves, and they feel that someone else is responsible. So, for example, an experimenter in a white coat at Yale University, you think, okay, well, actually, Yale is taking responsibility for this. It's not me. It's not on me. It's to do with responsibility, and that's what an agentic state is known as. Do we have any support for this then? So yes, we do. Blassen and Smith, students blame the experimenter for harm in the Milgram study when they were asked, so why did you do that? Why did you go up to the shocks? And they said, well, because he was telling me to. So that supports the idea of this legitimacy of authority and potentially the agentic state. But not everyone went up to the full shock. So why do some people resist it? And again, this is an explanation for what happened, but doesn't explain all of the findings. And actually, not everyone must have been in an agentic state, because lots of them stopped, didn't they? And lots of them, even if they did go up to the full amount, they said, "Oh, okay, well, I feel uncomfortable. Are they okay?" So they weren't. It wasn't as though they were saying, "Okay, well, that doesn't bother me. Nothing to do with me. It's the university's got to do with it. It's the university's fault," because they did feel some sort of personal responsibility. So actually, we can question the idea of this agentic state. And then, the experimenter repeatedly told concerned participants that he took full responsibility for the experiment, and there was a substantial reduction in obedience where participants were told that they were responsible for it. So that backs up the idea that the agentic state is important, and actually, if you do put the responsibility back on people, then that reduces the chance of obedience. And then again, there's cultural variations found in the response to legitimacy. So different cultures tend to respond differently to different authority figures. So it's not just as simple as saying, okay, well, if it's an authority figure, we will obey to it. We've then got dispositional explanations, and this is more to do with individuals and personality factors. And the big personality factor that you need to know is the authoritarian personality. Authoritarian personality can be described as someone who really values rules. They've got rigid beliefs. They've got quite conventional, old-fashioned maybe, values and ideas. They are hostile to outsiders. They hold stereotyped views, and they don't like ambiguity. Things have to be black and white, right or wrong. That's the definitions of an authoritarian personality. You can test this. This is tested on something called the F scale. It asks questions to do with those sorts of things. And that was Adorno et al. Was the one that measured the F scale. And actually, if you measure the F scale by asking people, so one of the questions was, there is hardly anything lower than a person who does not feel a great love, gratitude or respect for his parents. So that if someone agreed to that, they would be seen to be high on the F scale. And what you find is, if you test people on the F scale first and then put them into a Milgram type situation, then people are more likely to obey. So higher F scale scores, higher authoritarian personality scores, people tend to obey more. So it might be these personality traits could lead to obedience, and people who haven't got an authoritarian personality would be less likely to obey, and that might explain the difference then between the 65% that did go up to the top and those that didn't. Can we evaluate that? Well, yes, we can. There's only a correlation between the F scale and Milgram results, so as we well know from our research methods, correlation does not imply causation, so there's no cause and effect, there's just a correlation in the scores. Also, to use authoritarian personality to explain obedience, well, what you're saying there is that everyone that obeys has got that personality type. Very, very unlikely that all of the Nazi soldiers who did obey to the commands of higher officers had that sort of personality type. So maybe it's a factor, but not the overriding factor. There's also thought to be methodological problems with the F scale, the way that it measures people. So for example, it asks all the questions and it asks you to agree with it, so it could just be actually testing agreeableness rather than authoritarian personality. And so, and also, people could then potentially figure out what it's studying, so there could be demand characteristics as well. So it's not a good measure potentially. It's maybe a poor questionnaire. After conformity and obedience, the next part of the spec is social influence, and the first part of that is resistance to social influence. So why do people resist social pressures such as conformity and obedience? And as I've already said, we've looked at that in a couple of ways. So one of the reasons, you need to be aware of this, is social support. So if there are dissenters when it comes to conformity, so the Asch study with the lines, or obedience, so Milgram with the electric shocks, where the conditions where there was someone else in the group who also didn't go along with what was being asked to be done, that reduced social influence. So that's one of the areas that improved resistance to social influence. The other is something known as locus of control. So this was Rotter. Rotter came up with the idea of locus of control, and there are two main types of locus of control. There's an internal locus of control, which means that people believe that most of what happens to them is within their own control, their own. They have control over things as free will. They choose their own path in life. Whereas someone with an external locus of control believes more in fate, chance, outside factors. So, say you get a bad test result. Someone with an internal locus of control will say that maybe they didn't study hard enough, maybe they misread the question. It was their own fault. Whereas someone with an external locus of control might blame their teacher, might blame the wrong questions coming up at that time. They blame external factors. And so what it's been found is that those with an internal locus of control, because they believe themselves to be more responsible, they are less likely to conform in conformity studies and less likely to obey. Whereas those with an external locus of control, who believe in fate and external factors influencing them, lo and behold, unsurprisingly, they're more likely to conform and more likely to obey. So, evaluation of this then, Allen and Levine found that conformity decreased with one dissenter in an Asch type task. So, he got them to pick an option, an unambiguous option in a group, and if there was one dissenter, then someone else saying that they don't agree with the group, then conformity levels dropped. Gamson found similar in a test of obedience. So there were groups of people that were asked to put across ideas about a government oil policy. The researchers, it was set up so they wanted them to obey and follow along the rules, but they found that in 29 out of 30 groups where there was rebels, people dissenting, the rest followed and didn't. So it does seem to be this social support is a really important part in resistance to social influence. Holland tested the locus of control in a Milgram type study and found that so they tested their locus of control before they did the Milgram study. Those that came out as internal on locus of control, 37% of them didn't continue to the full shock, whereas only 23% of the externals didn't continue. So the internals were more resistant to social influence. So this supports the idea that that locus of control has a big impact again on resistance to social influence. Twenge conducted a meta-analysis of studies spanning about 40 years, so from the 60s to the early 2000s, and what they found is that over this time, resistance to obedience increased, but so did levels of external locus of control. So if our theory that locus of control was the key factor in resistance to social influence, what you'd expect to find is resistance to social influence going up at the same time as internal locus of control, but actually they found that external was going up. So over that time, people were saying no to obedience more, but they were also blaming other people more. So it contradicts what the theory would say, and so is a bit of a counterpoint to this idea in terms of explaining resistance to social influence. Moving on then, we get to minority influence, and as it says, it's how a smaller group has an effect maybe on a larger group. The key study you need to know here is Moscovici et al. In the Moscovici study, this was done on 32 groups of 6 female participants. So yeah, all the participants were females. They justified that by saying that women have a greater attention to detail. More about that later in the evaluation. And what happened here is there was a minority who were trying to have an effect on the majority. So out of those 6 participants, 4 were real participants and 2 were Confederates, so a minority of Confederates. And what happened here, they were presented with slides that were different shades of blue, and they were asked what colour are these slides, and they had the minority. Sometimes they were sat in the first and second spot, so they were the first 2 people to respond, and sometimes it was the first and 4th spot. So, but they were still giving the same answer, and that was key here. So what they were looking at is what response did the remaining 4 real participants, the naive participants, what did they say after the other 2 had said that this slide, which was objectively blue, and they had a control group where they asked them what colour is it, and all but 0.25% said it was blue, so it was definitely blue. But the Confederates said it was green, and then we look at what effect does this have on the majority. Well, what we found was for 8.42% of the trials where the minority had consistently said it was green, the real participants also said it was green. Now that may not seem like a large number, but when you compare that to, as I said, the less than 1% when there were no Confederates in there, that's a big change. And actually another key thing here is that when it was consistent, it was the 8.42%. So when the Confederates were both always say green, that's when we got the biggest result. When they sometimes said green and sometimes said blue, so when we had an inconsistent minority message, the percentage response dropped to 1.25%. So that suggests that inconsistent minorities don't have as much an effect as a consistent minority. And out of all of this, we also found that it was about a third, so 32% of the participants changed their answer at least once. So it does seem to, minority influence does seem to have an effect on at least a third of people. So this suggests, yeah, minorities can have an effect over the majority, particularly if their response is consistent. Obviously, it's not the same degree as a majority influence. You wouldn't expect it to be. But there are also a good percentage of people who aren't receptive to any sort of minority influence, and that's key as well. So what other things also help a minority get their view across? Well, commitment, otherwise known as the augmentation process. So if people show commitment to a cause, you had Emily Davison, who was a feminist who ran in front of the King's Horse. She showed commitment to her cause. That can help a minority get their view across. You've also got flexibility, which sounds contradictory to consistency. How can you be consistent and flexible? Well, the idea is that the message is consistent. You're always saying the same thing, but the flexibility might come in the way that you present that, and you might use terminology maybe that the majority are using to be flexible in the way you're delivering that message. And then you've also got the snowball effect. So if 2 people have an idea, if they can then just get 1 more person on board, that person can then get 1 more themselves, and it snowballs. You've suddenly got 4 people believing the same thing, and you've doubled your amount, and that's the snowball effect. So what are the benefits of this? Well, Moscovici's got wood. Sorry. Wood et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 100 studies that show consistency in minorities does have a big impact. So consistency does seem to be a big part of minority influence here. Also, as seems to be coming up quite often with a criticism of this social research. The task was fairly artificial, so judging the colour of a slide doesn't really have a big impact on the grand scheme of things. Whereas if this was maybe a jury decision or a political decision, then you would expect maybe there'd be less of an influence of a minority. And so can we actually apply these results? Have we got external validity here? It's hard to gauge. And as I mentioned before, you've got a gynocentric study here. It's focused all on females. Can we actually apply these results to men? Are we assuming that male minority influence is the same? Is it more? Is it less? And if you are assuming it's the same, you've got a beta bias. Some of your issues and debates from year 13 content coming through there. And last but not least, we've got social change. Social change is actually essentially just applying what we know about minority influence to real life examples where a view that might have been a minority view to begin with can then change and become a majority view. That's what social change is known as. So you've got things such as the suffragette movement, the civil rights movement. Currently there's climate change movement, things like that. Maybe even the Brexit situation can be explained through a smaller group having an idea and then maybe pushing that on the majority. The questions you tend to get in this part of the spec, it will probably be an apply question rather than a 60 marker. Not to say you couldn't get a 60 marker, you potentially can, but the way that I've seen this question asked is much more likely in a scenario. So you're given a STEM AO2, how would you get this view across healthy eating, for example? So some of the other ways. First is gaining attention. So again, think of the suffragette movement. They'll gain attention to their cause, and they have marches. Again, there's lots about climate change at the moment. You've then got consistency of the message, so the message being the same each time it's put across. You've then got deeper processing. So this says the majority might start thinking more about the issue. Maybe they haven't come across it and now they're starting to think about what the issue is. You've then got the augmentation principle, which I mentioned before. So this is a willingness to sacrifice yourself for your message. That could be putting yourself in danger or maybe even losing your life. Not a necessity, but it's that sort of thing. And the snowball effect will help. So you've got a small group, but you gradually gain more and more people, and to help your cause. And then you've got what they call social cryptonesia, which is where people forget the old ways, they forget the struggle, and actually the change becomes the new norm. So yeah, as I say, you need to be able to apply this. So good applications, the suffragette movement. So women never used to have the vote. The suffragettes campaigned for it. They put their bodies on the line. They had a consistent message. A few of them gained more and more and more support. And I'd like to hope nowadays you can't imagine women not having the vote. The social cryptonesia. Similar in the, not saying that again these things are completely solved, but we're certainly a long way away from where we were, but there may still be a way to go. Same with civil rights. So we used to have segregation and slavery, things like that. You can't imagine it these days. Well, that's the social cryptonesia. The people that were fought for civil rights, Martin Luther King, they had a consistent message. They were flexible. They had marches. Gay rights movement as well, Fathers for Justice, another one, as say climate change. You might think of healthy eating, Brexit. Any examples you can think of that you can apply to social change is good here. Just in case you do get some sort of evaluation or 60 marker here. So the issues here, well, lots of this is supported by research that we've already looked at, so Asch, Milgram, Moscovici, and we've criticised each of those bits of research. So those criticisms would count here. So we could say Moscovici, well, it was a female-only study. It lacked mundane realism potentially. There's also a question over the deeper processing. So could it be that actually the majorities use deeper processing more? So we tend to process things that don't fit in with the way that we think, and so the fact that deep processing, as mentioned, could be used by majorities or it could be used by minorities also. It's also likely, Nolan found, that normative social influence is likely to have an effect on minority influence here. So could you get people, could the minorities, how do we make social change happen? Or could we use normative social influence, make it seem like that's what everyone's doing? So Nolan did this while trying to say power. He had control groups, one to say please save energy, and the other saying, well, 80% of people are saving energy. And so what do people do? They want to try and fit in, and they abide by normative social influence. So you found the power usage drop when they were told that other people were saving power as well. And so that's positive. There you go, social topic in as condensed a form as I can do it. Thank you for listening, and I hope it's helpful.